They told me, in the quiet way of a verdict, that I was unsuitable for marriage. It was not spoken as a wish or hope. It was spoken as if I had been measured and found wanting, an inconvenient truth to be managed. It was March of 1856, and the Whitmore house smelled of coal smoke and lemon oil. The clock in my father's study kept a patient, indifferent time. I was 30 years old and had spent more years learning the layout of my own rooms than a woman of my station ought to need. If you intend to follow this whole story, please stay with me and subscribe to the channel. There are more hidden histories worth hearing. I have lived with that label long enough to know its shape. Unsuitable, too fragile, too peculiar, too much trouble to be matched with any man who feared for his name more than for the tenderness in his own hands. The accident that made me so began with a horse that bolted and a wheel that panicked. It ended with a fracture, a fever, and a body that would never again be taken for granted. I remember the first month as a fog of waxed linen and the iron taste of pain. I remember, too, how the village boys at the edge of the lane called me the crippled Miss Whitmore, the way they might have named a fence post. My limbs did not betray my mind, but in the eyes of others, the body's betrayal outweighed the mind's competence. My father, Colonel Richard Whitmore, was a man of measured resolves. He had fought a war in his youth and built his estate with the same economy. A row of tobacco barns, an orchard that gave the men work in autumn, a parlor where he entertained men whose fortunes were made by counting other people's acres. He loved me in the way a patriarch loves his property, careful, protective, accustomed to the logic of provision. When it became clear that no suitor would accept a wife who needed a chair to cross a room, he did what paternal providence had always meant in his mind. He set a plan into motion that would manage my wants as a steward manages the household accounts. Before his plan, there had been the parade of would-be suitors, each an exercise in diminishing expectations. There was Mr. Abernathy, who praised my reading of Virgil and then leered at the way my hands trembled when the cup was passed. He offered a polite condolence that read like a contract clause. There was Captain Lyle, who could not abide my refusal to dance when the boards were crowded because the chair's wheels protested. He called me brave in public and avoided me in corridors. Each refusal was not a private failing of mine, but a public arithmetic. My needs meant additional inconvenience, my presence a possible stain upon a family's letters and portraits. I learned to respond as my father did, with a calm that disguised a small, hot ache. I learned to seat myself at windows where the light would come in, and remember the hours by the sound of the blacksmith across the yard and the turning of carriages down the lane. There are moments when a name spoken in a room becomes a small covenant. I answered, because politeness is a thing one keeps even when it is a frail barrier against feeling. "Josiah," I said, "you will find I am more able than people assume." He smiled, the kind one gives when a person you meet refuses to be reduced to a note in someone else's ledger. "I dare say I have seen more able and unable than most," he answered. "We will make it suitable for you here." I was ashamed of how much the word suitable meant to me. I had been raised among servants and overseers, and yet the idea that a man born and raised into bondage might be my steadying presence was an affront to the entire edifice of my life. I wanted to decline his help on principle. I wanted to keep my dignity at the cost of constant falls. But there was a pragmatic selfishness in me, too. I had grown tired of bruises that no letter could explain. The colonel's plan would give me a measure of safety, and safety, in that house, read as a form of salvation. Our early days together were awkward and edged with mutual misapprehension. He did not treat me as a fragile object to be hidden away. He treated me as a person whose movements could be negotiated. He learned how the chair shifted when I reached. I learned the small architecture of the forge, where the bellows lay, how to balance my knees around the wheel of the cart so I might watch without being in the way. I watched him shape iron and found a lesson in the way he coaxed the metal from rigidness into pliancy. Heat, pressure, time. He taught me to sand down a rusted hinge until the grain shone like bone. One evening, while the sky outside held the wash of a late summer dusk, he came inside with a parcel wrapped in oilcloth. He placed it on the table between us as if it were an offering. When I unwrapped it, there were dog-eared pages of a book, Shakespeare, the plays in a battered volume whose spine had long surrendered. "I read when there's breath enough in the house," he said quietly. "I took to it because it takes a man out of the ground on which he stands." It is a strange and private joy to discover a soul that wants the same sort of solace. We began in those nights to read aloud to one another. He had an ear for cadence, for the places where a line wanted to be held and where it wanted to be let go. We read of kings and fools, of what men do when the world asks them to be less than they are. I would hold the book, and he would smooth the page with a finger like one smoothing a map. In the margin of my memory, his touch came to mean steadiness in more ways than one. There was a particular ritual that grew between us. After the day's labors, when the light had thinned to amber and the parlor smelled of lemon and wood smoke, Josiah would sit with the book and I would listen. Sometimes he would pause and translate a passage into the kind of plainness that makes the poetry live. "This says a man must hold his honor though the world asks him to drop it." He was not given to grand speech. His words were simple, faithful renditions that made the old lines into tools we could use to examine our days. You must understand that intimacy that grew between us existed in the hush between a world of property and an inner world of consent. He could not offer love by custom that the law acknowledged. His feeling, if it became any more, would be a theft of the master's order. Still, we found the private shape of affection in shared tasks, oiling the screws of my chair, planning the small alterations that would make the house easier to manage, the placement of handrails along stairwells. He was practical about my comfort as he was about his iron. He could not promise me a secure future, yet in the ring of that forge he fashioned the small certainties that made each day tolerable. It would be an error, and a dishonorable one, to make our affection a triumphal narrative. There were moments of humiliation, and the weight of his status pressed upon him like a shadow. Once, an overseer passed us in the yard and reflexively bowed his head, and then jerked it up as if to see whether the sight offended his propriety. Josiah stiffened but did not speak. Later, in the privacy of his hut, he would rub at the place on his forearm where a brand mark had been gotten. He said nothing, and yet I heard a whole sermon of sorrow in the silence. My father watched our developing closeness with the mixture of a man who is both proprietor and parent. He saw the practicality of Josiah's presence, a servant who might attend without complaint, a man who would keep his daughter safe, a worker whose skill in iron saved the estate money. But paternal affection, especially when mingled with pride and fear, is a complicated currency. For all his caution, the colonel felt an ache when he learned of our readings and our private plans. The Colonel's love for me had always included an element of paternal correction. He had the taste of a man who preferred his daughter's life to be tidy and explainable within the ledger of a respectable household. When he confronted me about it, one autumn evening when the wind had a chill and the hearth flashed in its usual domestic certainty, he did so with the steady voice of a judge. "You are not to imagine yourself as another sort of woman," he said, not unkindly. "I will not have the name of Whitmore sullied by imprudences." I answered him with a hard honesty that had learned to cultivate its own soil. "Father," I said, "Josiah has given me something neither suitor nor parish has offered. He has given me regard. Is regard a thing to be denied?" He regarded me as a man examines an account book and finds an unexpected figure. "Regard must be framed by order," he replied. "There are laws, there are expectations. You know no man who will risk his standing for a marriage that the law will not bear witness to. You know that men who keep their names safe are the only kind of family such as ours may claim." That night I walked the garden path, the leather of my chair whispering on the gravel, and weighed his words like metal on a scale. There is a particular cruelty in being told to be patient when patience is itself a form of the self being deferred. But the Colonel, who had learned to reckon with the law as a man must reckon with weather, also possessed an unexpected quality. He could be pragmatic enough to bend where others would break. He came to me not with the thunder of threats, but with the quiet of a man who had made a calculation. He hoped both would save his daughter's dignity and preserve the estate. "I could free him," he said one night, sitting by me with the colony's map open between his laps. "I could set down a paper, arrange a manumission. It would cost me in scandal, perhaps. It would save him from the sale if he is proven compromised." Free him? The word hung like a bell. Freedom, in our county, was a thing rarely bequeathed. It was a legal instrument as much as a moral claim, and its being offered by the Colonel was a small earthquake. There were men in Richmond who would raise eyebrows. There were neighbors who would measure the Whitmore house now by a different scale. Yet something in his tone, an almost apologetic willingness, tipped me more than his words did. He saw the injustice. He saw that the cost of inaction was higher than the cost of a small social scandal. If his plan was pragmatic, it was also marred by the same paternal logic that had led him to manage me in the first place. There was no gentlemanly romance in his proposal. It was an arrangement that would have to be designed so the law might accept it. "I will arrange for the papers," he told me. "If you are willing, we will make certain he has a claim that cannot be easily undone. It will be costly, and it will be spoken of, but it will keep him from the marketplace." "I will not be kept as a bargain," I said, and the words came sharper than intended. "I will not be bought." "You misunderstand me," he said. "This is not a sale. This is a means to make you both safe. If a man is free, then he may be a part of your life without the law's constant leash. There are moments when men will attempt to atone by making amends in papers. My father believed that a lawful instrument could tidy moral failures. He was wrong in many ways. Wrong in thinking a piece of paper could wash away the stain of a system. But he was right in this. Legal recognition would change the calculus of danger. It would not erase the cruelty of years, but it could blunt the immediate threat that a master's whim might one day take Josiah elsewhere. Você está no meio de uma frase-pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. It foi a kind of courage to continue living in the presence of a threat, rather than letting the threat swallow the living whole. On a day that lingered with the first hints of spring, as the river thawed and the air tasted of river mud, a letter came to the house. It was a small thing, sealed with wax and appointed in the hand of our lawyer in Richmond. He requested a meeting, propriety demanding a formal exchange. I sat in the parlor with the book fallen in my lap and watched as the colonel read the paper with a face that slowly, indubitably changed. "It is drawn," he said finally. "If it survives the judge's signature, and that requires a journey to Richmond, then his name will be entered as free." I wanted to be glad with his gladness. I wanted to let the music of the room lift us. Instead, I felt the peculiar, tight grief that comes when you realize how many dangers remain unaddressed by the smallest act of mercy. "Will it be enough?" I asked. "It will be a beginning," he said, which was both promise and admission. "It will make certain that a sale cannot be made without process. It will make him free in the eyes of the law." We embraced that small margin of certainty as if it were a great trove. Yet in the weeks that followed, the estate seemed to sense the tension of a thing half concluded. Men looked at Josiah with eyes that measured what he could fetch at market. Women watched the parlor door as if expecting a scandal to tumble from it. I noticed, too, the pattern of certain neighbors. Their polite visits dwindled and their polite letters thinned. There is a particular sorrow in noticing how little of the world's moral weight rests where it ought. Our small happiness, crafted out of reading and oiling screws and learning the curve of each other's hands, was nonetheless a rebellion against the architecture of the county. It was therefore more tender and more dangerous. On a bright April morning, when the lilies in the orchard had come alive and the light made the chair's mahogany gleam, Josiah took my hand in his as we stood by the window. He raised it then to his lips with a ceremony that was as modest as monumental. "Elelena," he said, the name between us like a bell. "If the law will give me breath, then I will spend it as I choose. If you will have me, I will not be less for it." I felt for a long moment as if the world had rearranged itself by a single impossible arithmetic. To be loved by someone who had chosen me, despite the cost, would be, if possible, the truest measure of my worth. When I answered, I did not promise him a future free of peril. I promised him instead the fidelity of a person who had been taught to read the contours of things and to tell the truth about them. "I will stand with you," I said, "for as long as it takes." We sealed that promise in a way that required no immediate legal paper, just a clean, simple ceremony between two people at the edge of a society that would not bless them. He read to me, from a small Bible he possessed, a verse about steadfastness. I braided his hair the way my mother had once braided mine. The world outside continued its commerce in sale and rumor, and yet inside the parlor, in the way light pooled on the floorboards, there was a small island of what might be called grace. Even then, the world was not idle. Men spoke, neighbors, overseers, discontented hands, about propriety and the natural order. Rumors are the county's embroidery. They are stitched of half-truth and malice and hang in the rafters of any estate. The colonel, who had made his choice, did not imagine the path would be without consequence. He knew that kindness is sometimes a currency that bankrupts a man in the eyes of his peers. Yet he had made his calculation and was willing to pay. And still, there remained the most fragile thing of all, trust. To trust that a piece of paper would survive the hungry demand of a market, that a man's freedom would not be undone by a whisper, that love could be lived in the daylight without calling down calamity. We learned to live with that fragility, as one lives with a thin glass over a hearth, careful, mindful, but not paralyzed. One night, months after the first reading of the plays, when the moon was thin and the house had that particular hush that comes with a family gone to bed, I woke to the sound of Josiah's voice, low and steady in the hall. He was speaking with the colonel. I could not make out the words fully, but I heard the tone of a man explaining how he might set up a shop of his own, and I heard the colonel's quiet question about letters and journeying to Richmond. Their voices were not raised. They were the voices of men arranging a future as one might arrange tools in a chest, practical, patient. I lay awake and felt the heaviness of the times and the delicate thread that was our plan. It has always been the hazard of our living that the most private vows can be shattered by the most ordinary of intrusions. A rumor, a jealous overseer, a purchaser's sudden need. Any of these could undo what we were slowly building. I understand now, with the slow wisdom that years after grants, that the colonel's decision to place an enslaved man as my attendant was both a kind of protection and a symptom of the same system that had made my life difficult. He loved me, and he managed me. He loved his property, and he attempted to correct what he could. That contradiction is as old as the house itself, and as human as the hands that sweep its floors. We kept on then with the business of living, the reading, the oiling, the planning. There were nights of laughter, and there were days when an overseer's scowl made Josiah's shoulders tense. There were small triumphs, a hinge that worked with less squeal, a stair rail that spared me a stumble, and small terrors, whispered threats of a debt elsewhere, the knowledge that manumission could be contested by men who did not like what they saw. We kept on then with the business of living, the reading, the oiling, the planning. There were nights of laughter, and there were days when an overseer's scowl made Josiah's shoulders tense. There were small triumphs, a hinge that worked with less squeal, a stair rail that spared me a stumble, and small terrors, whispered threats of a debt elsewhere, the knowledge that manumission could be contested by men who did not like what they saw. We kept on then with the business of living, the reading, the oiling, the planning. There were nights of laughter, and there were days when an overseer's scowl made Josiah's shoulders tense. There were small triumphs, a hinge that worked with less squeal, a stair rail that spared me a stumble, and small terrors, whispered threats of a debt elsewhere, the knowledge that manumission could be contested by men who did not like what they saw. We kept on then with the business of living, the reading, the oiling, the planning. There were nights of laughter, and there were days when an overseer's scowl made Josiah's shoulders tense. There were small triumphs, and there were small terrors, whispered threats of a debt elsewhere, the knowledge that manumission could be contested by men who did not like what they saw. But when the first light of dawn touched the floor, the first small click of a latch would begin whatever course the colonel's hand had set. I did not sleep that night. I sat with Josiah until the embers died down and the parlor filled with that particular cold that comes after a hearth has been left. We spoke of nothing and everything, of books to read in a new town, of how to patch a tarpaulin properly, of the children we might one day teach to read under a lamp. I remember his hand on mine, the heat of it, and how small acts of care gathered into a kind of defiance. The world outside might have its ways, but inside the parlor there was an intimacy that would not be easily erased. When the sun came, the colonel was already up. He stood in the doorway and spoke one blunt sentence that changed the geography of our lives. He had made the calculations, and he had chosen. The sentence was not a flourish. It was a decision written in the ledger of his mind and now spoken into being. What followed would require journeys, waiting rooms in Richmond with musty air, a lawyer's pen, and ultimately a thing that a piece of paper could at least partly accomplish: manumission. We would have to travel, to arrange, to risk the visibility that comes with legal processes. For me, every step northward would be a movement into a world that offered different hazards and perhaps different possibilities. I will pause here, for there are further reckonings to tell. Of a court clerk who looked uncomfortable, of nights on rough carriages, of a marriage under the weight of a nation's laws, of a city that received us with both welcome and its own prejudices. There are births and deaths to narrate, and the slow, steady building of a forge as a family center. But those pages require a new hand to unfold. For now, know that we staked our claim to a future with the modest currency of a piece of paper and the braver currency of each other's presence. We left the city gates behind before noon, the colonel's carriage heavy with bundles, and with that curious hush which sits over men who feel they have done something both right and dangerous. The road to Richmond unrolled itself in heat and dust. The horses breathed steam, and the townsfolk watched us from thresholds as if watching the slow passing of some uncommon procession. At every tavern we passed, there were faces that studied us and then looked away, as though propriety and curiosity were at war within them. The marriage was both a comfort and a liability. A comfort because in a country where laws often placed people in relation to property and not to personhood, the act of being named husband and wife by the state was a kind of armor. A liability because a name on a page could be contested, and a contest could mean that those who had thought themselves generous would be compelled by new laws, new votes, or a shift of popular mood to take back what they had let go. From Richmond we went northward in fits and stops. Nights in carriages taught me the geometry of my own body, how it would sleep or not, how my limbs craved a ground that would not roll. There were inns whose beds were a single feather of comfort, and others whose boards spoke of too many feet. Once, in a roadside tavern, a man came into the common room and, seeing me with my headscarf loosened, said aloud that free people ought to keep themselves out of sight. The colonel, present by chance or design, answered him with a civility that had the force of a guard. They will do as they please. The man spat and left. The leaving sounded like an agreement with my own brittle hope. When we reached the city that would for a long while be our home, small, open to the river, with warehouses and a market where fish were lined like scales, we found it to be a place of both welcome and old, stubborn prejudice. There was a cluster of houses on a lane just off the market, where others like us had taken rooms, where the children called one another by their given names and the women traded recipes and cautions in the back alleys. Here there were more doors open to us than I had expected, and yet there were barbs at the market and landlords who measured us not by the steadiness of our coin, but by some invisible calculation of comfort. We took lodgings above a cobbler's shop for the first months. The water ran thin, and the landlord kept his ledger open like a purse he was watching. We opened a small account with a shopkeeper for bread and the times we could not or would not cook. I worked where I could tend to household chores and to the small sewing that would earn coin. Josiah found work at a smithy on the river road, swinging a hammer that seemed to him both prayer and profession. The smithy smelled of coal and iron and sweat. It was there that we first saw how a man's hands could be turned into engines for a family's life. It was not smooth. There were nights when hunger was a contour we traced with our fingers by the candle. There were days I walked the market with nerves like stretched wire, because the right word from the wrong man could undo us. Once, a magistrate's deputy asked to see our papers and, after a slow reading that seemed to be testing the durability of the law, handed them back with an indifferent bow. Guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Você é narrador, palestrante, com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Você está no meio de uma frase-pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. There was a kindness there that could not be denied, and yet an entire past that refused to be untied by one man's hand. The forge, and what it represented, began to be more than livelihood. It became our center for learning. The children learned to carry coal and to hold the tongs. I taught them to mind the accounts and to read from a ragged primer I had purchased. We set a small lamp upon the counter, and the children practiced the letters until their fingers and tongues remembered the shapes of words. In the evenings, after the day's work, Josiah would sit on a low stool and shape a small iron toy for the little ones. And those toys, imperfect and heavy, became tokens of a life we had given ourselves. The neighbors brought news and requests. The women traded recipes and tips. The men who were steady with hammer and with honesty came to us when their own forges failed. Yet, even as the forge forged, there were tensions that moved like low thunder on the horizon. Rumors drifted in from the wider country about laws being tightened in distant places, about men in high stations who spoke of property and order with the certainty of a sermon. We listened to these rumors at the counter, our hands in dough or oil, and they had the quality of lightning that does not strike, but that always illuminates, briefly and terribly, what might happen should winds change. There were men who still believed that to free a person was a wrong to be corrected, by law or by violence. There were others who simply regarded us as an annoyance to the established order. We learned how to look for those faces and to keep our dealings open to redundancies. Always keep some coin at hand. Always have a neighbor who knows where you are. One afternoon in late spring, a letter came, edged at the fold with an unfamiliar script. It bore the colonel's seal and sat upon our counter like a thing that might contain a benediction or a summons. I opened it with hands that trembled like leaves. The colonel wrote that he had sold his property and that his life would take him away from the neighborhood of his youth. He thanked us, for what exact kindness he did not specify, and, in a hand that seemed to catch more than it said, wished us well. There was a small note enclosed, an invitation to call upon him should we ever need his name in testimony. The paper smelled faintly of tobacco and a kind of finality. We attended to our days. The forge needed tending as if it were a living animal. The children grew a little taller and a little bolder. The church bells down by the market measured Sundays into a steady march. But that letter was a marker. The colonel, who had been at once benefactor and reminder of the old world, was preparing to leave the lines of our lives. It gave me a strange permission to feel the future as if it were a room I might enter. Perhaps there would be new hands to help us, perhaps not.
Esta é a conclusão. Aumente a emoção para o nível máximo, mantendo a potência, e termine com uma pausa solene e impactante. We prepared, as any careful makers do, by making sure the hinges were oiled and the doors would not stick when at last we swung them open. And yet, for all the small planning, fate has predilections of its own. There are moments when public events, storms, proclamations, men in uniform pass through a life like a river changing its bed. I felt their approach first as an atmosphere, a tightening in the gut of the town, a sharpened look in the eyes of those who traded news. But those reckonings belong to the city's own clock. We had learned to keep our heads down and our hands busy. For a time at least, that was enough. In the light from the forge, Josiah's shadow would fall long across the floorboards, and I would sit near enough to feel the heat and near enough to know the world outside, with its long and uncertain distances, was beyond but not absent. We had staked a claim to life with copper and hammer, and with the steady business of morning bread. We had forged a household out of the smaller acts of care. There were, of course, more reckonings to come, of births that would demand certain decisions, of a child who would learn to read more quickly than the others, of a neighbor who would press us for favors and then ask for recompense. But those are for another day. And for now, the sound at our door is the evening bell calling the smiths in from the fields. Josiah lifts his hammer, and in the rhythm of strikes against steel, the room answers him with its steady chorus, noise that is both work and prayer, a song for a life remade. We keep our ledger open and our lamp lit. The future may bring storms and laws and men with sharp eyes, and yet at the hearth of our forge the simple law holds: we will meet them together.